Goldie Taylor is a journalist, cable news analyst, and previously a political strategist. Currently a contributing editor at the Daily Beast, she's also the author of 3 novels, and she has just today published her memoir, The Love You Save. The Love You Save is a raw and moving account of her childhood and adolescence in St. Anne, Missouri, and East St. Louis, Illinois. And it's my pleasure to welcome her here to the Hill. Goldie, welcome and happy Publication Day.
It is so good to see you, Niall.
Good to see you
with
too.
you.
Absolutely. So obviously we want to devote most of this conversation to the book, but for our audience, it's great to have you here for some political analysis. So just a couple of questions. Broadly speaking, President Biden, sure. How do you think he's doing? How do you rate his chances of winning a second term?
I think, frankly, if you look at the Biden administration and what they've been able to accomplish over, this first run here, it's been quite extraordinary given the environment, the political environment that we have existed in. And so when you look at, what's happened post January 6th and these different poles of ideology here, you would think that this would be an entire lamed up presidency writ large. It hasn't been. Now, that's not to say what might happen now that you have a GOP-controlled House.
That changes.
That changes the math dramatically, and how this administration will be able to navigate that really will be a testament to what skill they really have. I don't know that we have seen this kind of environment, at least in the modern age. But for the first half of this presidency, I don't think that Democrats could have asked for better. As for re-election purposes, if President Biden wants to run for re-election, he is the titular head of the Democratic Party. It is his choice. I don't know a Democrat around who wouldn't support him, given what he's been able to accomplish. But I do believe that, to be frank, age is age. Not that he would be too old, but that the American people might perceive that they want a new generation of leadership. And so if he is to receive any pushback at all, it might be from a new generation of Democrats who are looking to advance the party in different ways. I think that we would be served well by a second term from President Biden, however.
You also write a lot, not just the Daily Beast, but everywhere, about social justice issues. And we are speaking just a few days after the horrendous video of Tyre Nichols killing emerged. We seem to have these things, these events happen. We have very pained conversations in the aftermath. Do you think there have been any positive changes? Are you optimistic about any positive changes?
I am old enough to remember the initial footage from Rodney King. I am old enough to remember the police chase. I'm old enough to remember the batons in the night and the shine of the helicopter lights that night. When I watched, and I could not watch, I know some people couldn't, but I could not turn away when I watched Tyre Nichols and the end of his life. It reminded me so much of Rodney King. Now, the complexion of the officers was different. But I don't think that's a relevant question when you're talking about anti-Black policing policies. The over and mass policing of non-white communities in this country is truly a problem and has been since its inception. I wrote about it today in Time Ideas, that I don't know that we have had, for all of the energy around social justice, for all of the energy around Black Lives Matter, for all of the calling attention to this issue, my son is no safer today than he would have been 30 years ago.
And how do you feel about that?
It's a scary proposition. We talk about the notion of having to give your children, I gave all of my children the same instructions. When you're stopped by police, this is what you do. But it's like a faulty insurance policy, as in Tyre Nichols' issue. The insurance policy didn't pay off. He did everything right. And so that is as much as you can give your children. And then you hope that the universe conspires to take care of the rest. But in too many cases, it simply doesn't. So I'm afraid for my son in so many ways. He was accosted by police a few years ago, accused falsely of stealing his own MacBook with a weapon pressed against his back and handcuffs. My grown son called me in tears. It was traumatic for him to be at home in Atlanta and have a police department that he'd grown up to trust to assault him in that way. I said, but for a crossing of the stars, my son could have been Tyre Nichols that afternoon. And so, sure, we're still afraid, I think, as a community, but that means that there is work left to do. And we as a nation have to reconcile ourselves to it.
And do that work, presumably.
And do that work. But I think the problem is too many of us don't recognize that there is work to do. We're still stuck on the notion of a few bad apples and unwilling to look at the full of the barrel to see what's really happening in policing in our communities.
That obviously in itself is a very long conversation,
Sure.
but I do want to get to the book, which is the reason why we're here. I would highly recommend it to people. It's beautifully written, as I would expect, honestly. It is, I suppose, the thing that surprised me was just how painful and traumatic, honestly, many of the experiences are. Sure. And I think in sensitive areas, it's just better to be as direct as possible. The emotional heart of the book, it seems to me, concerns two experiences of you being raped.
Yes.
Once when you were 11 years old by an older high school boy, and later repeated attacks
Yes.
by a member of your extended family.
Yes.
First of all, do you want to say anything more about what happened, or do you want to leave the descriptions of those in the book?
You know, I think for the purposes of our audience, because you don't know how information hits people, that we'll leave it in the context of the book. But I'll tell you what I was after. I was after not simply talking about my life post these experiences, but really to talk about the communities in which we all came to growth, and the differences in St. Anne, Missouri, and in East St. Louis, Illinois, the differences in the educational systems, the differences in how parenting with that war was waged, the differences in whether or not you thought your children to be safe at night or in the presence of police officers. We were the third black family to live in St. Anne, Missouri. We were renters, lived at the top of the hill on St. Christopher Lane, and once the police knew that my brother had moved in, we're talking about 1973, 74, they circled the block, literally stalking this teenage brother of mine. It was clear to them that he was going to be up to no good at all. And so the differences in the life that we lived in St. Anne as compared to the life that we lived in East St. Louis's market, I wanted to talk about that. And I wanted to talk about the societal ills, the social pathologies that come along with that. Sure. And then our family's ability, our inability, to navigate them with any fluidity.
And I think that does come out in the book. I was going to leave this till later, but since you raise it, I mean, much of the book is describing you when you're really a very young child, and so I can't now remember which relative it is who basically blames poor people for being poor, essentially, and says, it's their own.
Poor people got poor ways. Right. My grandmother used to say.
All of that.
But I've got to tell you that it's an old African American adage. It's an African American proverb, we'd say. Sure. That poor people have poor ways, and that I was raised to believe and think that poverty was a moral question. And when we finally broke out of that, it was stunning to me as to who was giving me that message. Sure. And that it came from black and white alike. And
it also, we should say, while we're on the subject of sort of how broader topics link with personal trauma, sure. Your father was murdered when you were a very young girl, when you were five years old?
I was 5.
So, loss was there in the most sort of visceral way from the circumstances in which he found himself. In relation, Goldie, to what happened to you and the experiences that I talked about a couple of minutes ago, it has to be a difficult decision to write about
Yeah.
rape.
Yes.
And I assume the decision to, as it were, go public with that was maybe years in the making.
Yes.
Did something precipitate you reaching a point where you thought, no, I should do this?
You know, I think that my writing career, for the length of it, has been imbued by personal experience. And so I wasn't ever afraid to talk about trauma, to the extent that it didn't impact other people's lives, though. And, you know, I remember Ta-Nehisi Coates and I ran into each other in the MSNBC green room. And I talked about my father's murder on air. He was seated next to me. We were on the show. And he said, you know, when are you going to write a memoir?
Okay.
And I said, too many guilty people are still alive. That was in 2014. There came a time when I felt as though I was carrying burdens from other people, and I was waiting for them not to be impacted. It happened in August of 2019 where I decided I was going to put it down, that I was tired of carrying the burdens of others. In writing it, I decided that I needed to tell the story only I could tell. And that meant that if there were family or people that I grew up with who were offended to have their truths out, I'd have to be okay with that. Because the larger question for me was, one, was it cathartic for me? Yes. But two, could telling my story provide safe harbor for other young men and women who are in similar circumstances today or lived through them in their histories? Would it give them a sense of solidarity, that there is someone standing with them, that there is a safe space for them to take their traumas? Because these things get passed down through generations. I remember once hearing the stat that if you tested children living in inner cities, that their rates of PTSD were higher than war veterans returning to these shores. In writing this book and going back and excavating our family lives, I know that to be true. But if that is to be ended, if that is to be eradicated, we've got to deal with it.
Sure. And I want to get to that point in just 1 second. But you know, you mentioned catharsis there, and it strikes me that whenever very bad things happen, part of the wound is the very bad thing, but part of the wound can be the secrecy around it. Now, I'm just wondering, do those traumas that you endured of various kinds, those will never go away, and you'll have to live with those. But does the breaking of the secrecy around them give you any sense of that burden lightening, or not really?
I had a sense of renewed peace that I'd never felt in what it will now be my 55 years this summer. That there was a lightness about my life, about what was ahead of me, the sense of possibility. In this second half of your life, you think about whether or not, you know, I started taking new languages and learning to snow ski and do other things that I would not have thought to do before. I found myself living more fully. And so, yeah, there was a cathartic part about this. But I think for some of the other people who populated my life, that for them it was a freeing as well, that there were some things that they too could let go. Sure.
And have you got any negative reaction from people who are alluded to in the book?
No, because I think we all know who we are. My mom and I have had such wonderful conversations in these recent couple of years. We always have had, you know, a great relationship, you know, in my adult years, but in these recent years we've come together with a closeness where we've begun to just talk honestly about the world that she came from and what she had to give to me and to my sister and brothers. And she said, you know, I feel like I failed you. And I said, I feel like you gave me every single thing you ever had. And for that, I am grateful, because those are the things, watching you go to work every day and the kind of work that you did and how you showed up with integrity, that informed me. much greater than any other thing that I may have been missing. And so I'm insanely proud of my mother, insanely proud of her.
And just to mention one other figure who plays a very central part in the book, Aunt Gerald is a sort of de facto mother in many ways.
She is.
In many parts of the book, we should say she is now deceased.
She's passed away.
But I mean, I was kind of fascinated by her because on one hand, she kind of terrorizes you and uses the Bible and her own paraphrases of the Bible to do so. But there is a genuine love there. And in fact, as I was reading the book, there's a quote from a different Grandma Alice, I think, who talks about the fact that love doesn't always come packed up and pretty like you want it. Someone like your Aunt Gerald seems quite a good example of that. It's a very complex relationship.
She is an incredible example of that. There is no doubt in my mind, or any other child who crossed my Aunt Geraldine's threshold into her house, of how much she loved her family and the children that she was charged with raising, many of whom were not her own, that her doors were open to whomever needed the night. And she would sleep you on the floor, on a sofa, except her good sofa. And you
gotta keep some things safe.
Gotta keep some things sacred, including that yellow paisley sofa and the plastic on it.
Sure.
But she was angry. And I never knew why, with the incredible husband and Uncle Ross that she had. He made her a homemaker. He had her quit her job. And I never knew why she was just so angry. And then I learned. I don't talk about this in the book, won't talk about her story here. But I learned why she was angry. It put everything really into focus, that she had her own list of traumas, and they were lengthy. But she took that and rolled it into a level of love for these children that was, she wanted to protect us from what she had seen, from where she had been. And so the school bell rang at 3:30. I needed to be down the road, the block and a half to school. 3 minutes I had to be on the front steps of our house because she knew that there were dangers lurking out there that no 12 or 13-year-old girl should have to confront in East St. Louis.
And she was right about that.
She was right about that. She's right about that.
But she was also very,
Gosh, yes.
Abusive, really.
Well, she'd send us to the grocery store to get her some ice cream, but she wouldn't give us any. She was abusive in ways that you just could not fathom. I was afraid, I know that I see in the book, to hear her call me by my full name. People know me as Goldie. She'd call Goldie Taylor from the top of the stairs in such a way that I would shiver in my skin. But when she passed away, a couple of years ago, that was the only thing I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear her say my name.
I do want to circle back, Goldie, to the sort of bigger societal sort of issues that you mentioned earlier, because, it did. You write about this very well, and it's the book is sort of interspersed with commentary about how your story and the stories of the people around you is impacted by much, much bigger forces. Not only racism, though that is part of it, but, deindustrialization or the depopulation of towns and cities, and East St. Louis and other issues like that. It strikes me, just to put it very plainly, that okay, so I don't normally talk about personal stuff. I'm the stepfather, though we don't use that word, father to 2 black children. And so those experiences have at least given me perhaps more direct experiences in all kinds of ways. It strikes me that many, many, many black Americans, even if they themselves are making it, have a proximity to trauma of various kinds. That is just not the case for most white Americans.
In different ways, yes.
Right.
The trauma comes from different sources, but
yes,
I think the trauma across is consistent.
Sure.
But it comes from different sources for us, yes.
And do you think that is appreciated or understood in American society at large?
I can't believe that it is. I can't sort of put my arms around the notion that these cultural differences are the very thing that divide us. If you look at, say, our friend group, who do you go on vacation with? Who comes to your home for dinner? It tends to be quite a homogenous crew, right? People of your own religion, people of your own race. We don't cross very often. So we don't get to talk about those experiences where we may be more alike than our politics suggest, as a Barack Obama would say.
Sure.
I actually disagree with that. But we would have more of those conversations where we could find a sense of commonality. And I think there'd be a greater appreciation. I think people would know why Tyre Nichols ran after the first meeting, because he has seen it before. And this could be the end of my life. People heard him when he called for his mother, because that is what a black man would do. He would call for his mother. My brother was in a horrific accident as a young 20, and we thought he was dead. And all he did was say, "I'm sorry, Mama," because that is something that is so intercultural. We don't get to share those experiences enough. And when we don't have those cross-cultural experiences, that keeps our politics divided. That keeps us from finding commonality and real solutions to solve real issues.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And I think it also breeds suspicion and misunderstanding. I mean, the classic thing of, if, I'm not saying this in Tyre Nichols' case, but just generally, if the police stopped and searched someone, they must have had reason to do so. And often that's not at all the case. You
know, in Tyre Nichols' case, no one can find probable cause for the stop yet. And we are several weeks beyond his death. That is unimaginable. That you have stopped, dragged from the car, approached the car guns out with no probable cause. That's a real issue for me. But I think we tend to give the men and women in the blue the benefit of the doubt. But for video, and I said this in the Walter Scott case in South Carolina, where I went and I followed Walter Scott's footsteps as he was chased across that field. But for video in Walter Scott's case, but for video in this case, but for video in Eric Garner's case and others, we wouldn't have known what happened. But for what happened to Philando Castile in Minnesota, if we had not had video, either a breast camera from an officer or, a cell phone camera, the proliferation of smartphones is starting, we think, to change the math. But for that, we would have given the officers the benefit of the doubt, and the case would have been closed, and everyone, except the family, would have moved on.
Yeah, it has really changed things in terms of exposing just simply the truth.
In terms of simply exposing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One final thing about the book before we finish. I mean, we could talk for much longer, but we can't. There is, as I've mentioned a lot, there are a number of painful experiences in the book, and people can read about those for themselves, and I'm sure they'd be as moved as I was by them. There is a likeness in the book in terms of the young child Goldie finds this escape and wonder really in literature and in the word, and it's initially a famous British poem, Invictus, but it's later James Baldwin and other authors. It's interesting that love has sort of animated much of your adult life. But just talk a little bit about that, about how you found words and language and literature empowering as a child in difficult circumstances.
I fell in love with words. They were not only a protection from Aunt Gerald, but they were also an escape to new lands, distant places. The journey of discovery is in, not the seeking of new lands, but seen with new eyes, as a Proust quote. I've always lived that. Even when I hadn't ever heard of Marcel Proust, I'd always lived that as a mantra, that I could go places in books. I could take myself places if I wrote my own stories. And so it doubled over in middle school. It grew more, even exponentially in high school. But by the time I was in my mid to late 20s, I was dead set that I was going to write for a living, that I was going to figure out how to do that for a living. I loved it with that much zeal.
And so it proved.
And so it proved.
Sure.
I am going to spend tomorrow night in St. Louis with that 8th grade honors English teacher, Peggy Lewis LeCompte. She's plays a large role in the book. She's in conversation with me tomorrow night. We can talk about the Goldie that she knew back then and what she saw and why.
Sure.
Yeah.
And very finally, Goldie, one quote toward the end of the book, toward the very end of the book, when you say, there are burdens that I believe were my obligation to carry in silence. For far too many years, I lived life as if holding my breath. Able to let your breath out a little bit now?
Yeah, that feels pretty good.
Good.
Able to live, to breathe freely and of my own volition.
Sure.
Heart beats evenly now.
All right. Well, listen, Goldie, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. To our audience, the book is The Love You Save. The author is Goldie Taylor. And Goldie, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you, Niall.
Thanks.